Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 20th of May of 2026. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where Zelensky personally and his inner circle are talking just about one thing. They're talking just about a possible threat from the north. President Zelensky stated that Russia may launch an attack on the Kiev-Chernihiv direction from Belarus. He stated this today, and he also emphasized that Russia is preparing to mobilize 100,000 people. I would like to remind you that in 2022 the Russians had a mobilization, and during the previous mobilization the Russians mobilized 300,000 people, and during the 2022 this helped the Russians to stabilize the Kharkiv front line, the Zaporizhzhia front line, and so on. As of the 2026, Zelensky believes that 100,000 people is enough for the northern offensive operation. It seems that Zelensky believes that the Russians are going to mobilize 100,000 people just with the purpose for that the Russians will deploy them along the border between Ukraine and the Republic of Belarus, and these forces is enough, according to Zelensky, to start an offensive operation, probably in the direction of the city of Kiev. So this is the position of the President of Ukraine, Zelensky. Another important thing that the Commander-in-Chief of the Armored Forces of Ukraine also confirms this information. He said that the threat from Belarus is real. The Russian General Staff is currently actively calculating and planning offensive operations from the north. As for the Republic of Belarus, we have some signals from this area that probably something is brewing from this area, but it's very difficult to say whether this is something about possible offensive operation from the Republic of Belarus or something else. Very difficult to understand. As of the previous 2 months, we received lots of very interesting updates and statements made by the Belarus authorities, and there was a statement made by the President of the Republic of Belarus that the Belarusians needs to prepare for war. He said that the Belarusian president asserts that it is impossible to win a modern war without a ground operation. He was talking about the US-Iranian conflict, but also he said this at a meeting on state weapons programs and called for the army to be prepared for such operations. So this is a signal. He said that the Belarusian forces must be prepared for a ground operation. So as of now, it's just a statement and nothing more, but we have some signals from the side of the Republic of Belarus. Another important thing is the things and events that have taken place since the beginning of the 18th or the 19th of May of 2026. We have another signal made by the Belarusians. We have already discussed this yesterday. Belarus has restricted access to forests near the borders with Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. Among the possible scenarios, either threat in Volyn and the Suwalki corridor to force Ukraine to maintain more reserves. So the sources are saying this and drawing this picture as if the Belarusians are planning or are going to begin this offensive operation tomorrow. But we need to understand that it is impossible to start everything tomorrow. It's basically impossible. Another important thing is that also during the same days and these days we have another very interesting article published by the Western media. And according to this article, the US demands that Kiev convince Europe to lift restrictions on the import of Belarusian fertilizers. I would like to remind you that several weeks ago the United States of America lifted sanctions, and now the Belarusians are able to sell fertilizers, at least using dollars, and to sell them to the United States of America and to the rest of the world. But the most important problem for Belarusians is the logistics, because it is expensive to use the Russian railway service and the Russian port infrastructure. The best way for Belarusians is to sell fertilizers through the territory of Lithuania and through the Lithuanian port infrastructure. But the Belarusians are not able to do this because due to the fact that the Americans lifted sanctions, we know that the European unions haven't done this. So that is why, according to this article, the US demands that Kyiv convince Europe to lift restrictions. The export of potassium used to increase the yield of agriculture crops was the main source of foreign exchange earnings for Belarus before Western sanctions. At the beginning of this year, the US already lifted some of its own restrictions on the supply of fertilizers from Belarus. The Trump administration is seeking to strengthen ties with the Belarusian leader and a close ally of Putin. Without the lifting of European sanctions, the influence will be limited by the fact that Belarus cannot use its traditional sea roads through the Baltic Sea terminals and will be forced to rely on Russian ports and railways. And we know that this way is much more expensive in comparison with the way through the Baltic states. And it seems that all these things are connected with each other. So Zelensky says that the Belarusians are planning for something from the territory of the southern Belarus, from the territory along the border. The Belarusians and the US are pushing Zelensky to that he must, let's say, force the European countries to lift sanctions on Belarus. So we believe that it's just a game. It's just a game between Belarus, Ukraine, and the European Union. But the most important thing of this game is that most likely Zelensky will not do this. He will not convince or he will not ask the European partners to lift sanctions from Belarus. Probably he may do this, but in exchange he would ask most likely to force Belarusians not to allow the Russians to locate their forces along the border between Belarus and Ukraine, and most likely he would ask that Belarus must allow or force or to close not bases, but equipment and retranslators that probably the Russians used when they attacked the territory of Ukraine with drones. So if you remember, since the beginning of this year, we have already discussed this, that every time the Russians launch massive drones along the border in the direction of Ukraine, lots of drones are flying along the border with Belarus, which means that these drones have connections through these retranslators with the mainland, with the Russian Federation. So Zelensky may ask this for exchange. So everything is possible, and let's wait and see what is going to happen next, of course. And another important thing, of course, if the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans are not able to find this solution to this situation with the Belarusian potash, then most likely Zelensky may face a real threat from the north, because in this case the territory of Ukraine and the Ukraine authorities and Zelensky will have no value for the authorities of the Republic of Belarus. And another important signal that most likely everything that we see these days about the situation from the north is just a speculation from the Zelensky side, is that Zelensky and Ukraine hasn't announced any evacuation of any settlement along the border. Because we know if anything was possible through this area, obviously the Ukrainian authorities would already announce major evacuation from these regions. But now we don't see anything like this. But at the same time, these days we receive lots of updates about the evacuation from the Zaporizhzhia direction. So let's discuss now this territory. I would like to remind you that several days ago, pro-Ukrainian sources stated about the major evacuation from the cities of Nikopol and Marganets. So these two settlements, as we discussed during the previous videos, are located just 10 kilometers from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which means that these territories, these settlements are the perfect foothold before any possible operation in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station. And as we discussed during the previous videos, Ukraine has already prepared its object of energy infrastructure in this area, which means that if the Ukrainians are able to take under complete control the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, they would be able to connect this power station probably within months with their energy infrastructure. And so this is about Nikopol and Marganets, and this report about the evacuation from this this area we received several days ago. But these days we start receiving updates that the Ukrainians also announced a major evacuation from the settlements of Nova Oleksandrivka and Nova Mykhailivka. As for the settlement of Nova Oleksandrivka, this territory is located to the north of the area where the Ukrainians months ago launched the Western Zaporizhzhia counter-offensive operation. And as we discussed during the previous videos, during this period of time, the Ukrainians managed to improve their position significantly. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 30th of April, and this is the way how the map has been adjusted since the beginning of the 30th of April of 2026 till the 20th of May of 2026. The Ukrainians managed basically to recapture everything that the Russians were fighting for between late 2025 and first months of 2026. So the Ukrainians, according to the latest updates that was published today by a pro-Ukrainian source, managed to recapture completely the settlement of Stepnogorsk, and this is the most important. Maybe the settlement hasn't been recaptured completely yet, but the sources are saying that currently there are more Ukrainians in the area of the settlement of Stepnogorsk than the Russians. So this is the latest update that was published by a pro-Ukrainian source. And this is the western Zaporizhzhia direction where the Ukrainians announced a major evacuation a bit further to the north. The second area where the Ukrainians announced a major evacuation is the settlement of Novi Mykhailivka, which is located right in the area of the Russian breakthrough between the settlements of Верхняя Терсва, Воздвижевка, Rizdvyanka and Tirnovate. So it seems that the Ukrainians are preparing themselves in advance if the Russians decide not to move further in the western direction from the area of breakthrough from between these villages, but in the northwestern direction with the purpose to cut this territory into pieces and then even probably to test and to prepare and to try to advance further in the direction of the city of Dnipro. And later today, during the evening of the 20th of May of 2026, we received another report that pro-Ukrainian sources announced a major evacuation from 4 additional villages. The village of Rivne, Zhuravlyovka, Hutara, Chaplina, and the settlement of several villages of this area. So now we see that this is something like a strict line between the city of Energodar, Marganets, Nikopol towards this area. We can connect these villages and this will give us a better understanding of the situation. So it seems that the Ukrainians are planning to evacuate everything along this line between the cities of Nikopol and Chaplina. So this territory announced, as for now, major and partial evacuation, but we believe that when the Ukrainians finish with the evacuation with these announced villages, then they will start the next wave, the next, and then the next wave of evacuation until they evacuate everything through this yellow line. And as you can see, this is something, a wall like a wall between the Russian positions in the area of the cities of Energodar, Stepnogorsk, Kamenskaya, Gulyai-Polye, and then further in the northeastern direction towards the settlement of Pokrovsk and Gavrilovka. As of now, it's very difficult to say what exactly the Ukrainians are planning. Either they're planning to probably deploy additional troops in this area to intensify their own counter-offensive operation further in the southern direction towards the southern parts of the Zaporizhzhia region, or the Ukrainians are preparing themselves before possible offensive and major advances of the Russians that are going to start within the next several days during this summer military campaign. Now, very difficult to say, but this is where we're talking about a signal. So this is a signal that something is going to happen and that something is happening in this area. And as for the northern direction, we haven't received even a single report that anybody is preparing to evacuate anything in this area, which means that everything about the northern direction is just a speculation from Zelensky's side. He basically just doesn't want to accept demands of the United States of America that Ukraine must convince Europeans to lift sanctions on Belarusian potash. This is probably the only thing that Zelensky doesn't want to accept. So that is why this is the way he shows his resistance, because he understands that if Belarusians will be able to sell potash through the world and through Europe, obviously, this can lead to the situation that Belarusians and Russians through Belarus will be able to normalize relations with the European Union, and this is something that doesn't fit his understanding of the situation. And another important thing is that today Ukrainian sources and the main intelligence of directorate stated that Russia is preparing to destabilize the situation and undermine external support for Kiev. Allegedly, Moscow demands that special services, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the media maximally disperse in the Ukrainian and European space topics that are actually discussed daily by Kiev and Western media without Russia. Discrediting mobilization in Ukraine and the military leadership responsible for the staffing of the armed forces of Ukraine. Discrediting Zelensky, his team, and family members. If you remember these days, we received lots of updates on the matter that that Zelensky's wife was either about to be arrested or already arrested, but now we see that nothing of this sort happened, and dispersed the media scandal around Yermak and Mendel's interview. So this is the position of Kiev. This is the way how they try to stabilize the situation after so many updates, so many different compromises and bad information were leaked by Western media. So this is the situation probably that is currently taking place between Kiev, Moscow, Minsk, and so on. Now let's move further and let's discuss the massive attacks. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians launched at least 2 waves of attacks to attack objects of energy infrastructure of Ukraine. During the previous night, between the 19th and the 20th of May of 2026, the Russians used 155 drones to attack Ukraine, and during the day during the 20th of May, the Russians used additional 84 drones to attack Ukraine. And mainly the Russians were attacking logistics, energy infrastructure, and the Russians were attacking logistics, energy infrastructure, and warehouses. According to information we have, a warehouse or a post office was destroyed on the theater of the city of Kharkiv. It seems that this is the moment when the Russians attacked this post office building, and here we can see the consequences. And another warehouse was destroyed on the theater of the city of Dnipro. This is the moment when the Russians just attacked this object of logistics, and this is the video where the consequences of this attack. And the Russians were attacking objects of energy infrastructure, and you know that today pro-Russian sources published a very interesting video of this one, and here we can see a video of how Russians were attacking objects of energy infrastructure of Ukraine and checkpoints and different military objects and so on through Ukraine during the May, using drones and using massive attacks. And in this video we can see several episodes that were recorded through the western parts of Ukraine. So these attacks took place during the May and April of 2026, and as you can see, the Russians currently have a very good and stable connection with the mainland, and they are able to make a video of their attacks. So one of these episodes took place in the area of the city of Lutsk. The Russians attacked the settlement with drones and recorded, and now they published this video. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Konstantinovka direction. The biggest number of updates are coming exactly from this area. During the previous 24 hours, additional changes were recorded in the area of the cities of Novodmitrivka, Konstantinovka. These are the changes on the ground during the previous 5 days. So this is the end of the 16th, this is the 17th, 18th, 19th of May of 2026, this is 20th of May, so the Russians continue advancing, and now it seems that the Russians are focused to improve their positions between the villages of Malacharka and Dmitrievka, so they try to improve the eastern Konstantinovka flank. if Russians are able to take all these territories under complete control, and this is most likely exactly what the Russians are tasked for, then in this case, this is going to be the beginning of the end of the Konstantinovka defense operation, and from these positions, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. We still don't have any update on the matter of the encircled group of Ukrainians in the area of the micro-district Promyslovy, and we have nothing about the situation with Ukrainians who, according to pro-Russian sources, were encircled in the area of the villages of Podolska, Chervona, and Mykhailivka. But you know that today we haven't received lots of updates about the situation on the ground, because today the most important update for Russians, of course, is the meeting between the President of Russia and the President of China, Xi Jinping. As you may know, today they have a very important meeting in China, and the presidents were talking lots about multipolar world, and furthermore they signed an agreement on establishing of this multipolar world and its rules. Very interesting document, and of course it would be very good to see this resolution, what exactly the leaders of these two states were talking about. And this is about just resolutions, but another important thing is that according to information we have, China and Russia signed an agreement to build another line, a railway line between China and the central part and western part of Russia. And according to information we have, the Chinese are going to build these railways on the Chinese standard. You know that Russia and China has different standards of railways. The Russians have their own numbers, their own length and so on, width of railways. Chinese have their own. And now the sources are saying that China will build railways on the territory of Russia using Chinese standards, which means that this will allow the Chinese companies and Russians to exchange with goods, with products, with different things much faster without the need to replace the railways and different things along the border. But this process will take time up to 2030, which means that there are still lots of things will happen before this happens. And now let's return back to Ukraine. We have discussed the situation in the area of the city of Konstantinovka. Once again, we haven't received many updates when talking about changes on the ground, but we have lots of videos of how Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine through this area, and it seems that the general battle, the major battle of the special military operation has begun, and we are talking about the battle for the Slaviansk-Konstantinovka agglomeration. As for the northern directions, the Russians continue their offensive operation in this area, and the biggest number of changes were recorded in the area that yesterday was captured by Russians, according to the Minister of Defense and the group of forces north. And we are talking about the village of Volokhovka, and these are the changes on the ground between the previous 3 days. This is the end of the 18th, this is the 19th, and this is already the end of the 20th of May of 2026. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.